This is a GCSE chemistry tutorial within topic 10. In this video we will look over the Earth's resources. In this video we will be looking at what we mean by a resource. We will have a look at both finite and renewable resources. We will look at recycling and we will look at life cycle assessment. So what are natural resources? Well, natural resources are resources that form without human input. This can include anything that comes from the earth, sea or air. This would include cotton and oil and things like coal. Some natural resources can be improved upon. These are known as new resources, which we looked at in the previous video. For example, rubber is a naturally occurring product, however we can make synthetic products that improve upon this. Agriculture can also provide conditions where natural resources can be enhanced. One way where we can improve on agriculture is in the use of fertilizers, which we looked at in another tutorial video. All natural resources can be placed into two categories. These are finite and renewable resources. A renewable resource reforms at a similar rate to or faster than we use them. Because of this, we can continually use renewable resources. For example, things like solar power or things like timber, which is a renewable resource as trees can be planted following a harvest and only take a few years to regrow. Other renewable resources include fresh water and food sources. On the other hand, we have finite resources. These are non-renewable resources and therefore do not form quickly enough to be considered replaceable, so these will run out. Examples of finite resources include the fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, as well as metals and the nuclear fuel sources such as uranium and plutonium. These may have to be dug up from the ground in the form of ores, at which point they must be extracted. Dependent on the type of resource we're looking at, it will go through many different processes. For example, fractional distillation in order to separate out the products of crude oil, as we looked at in the alkanes video, as well as things like reduction, which we looked at in the redox videos in order to produce a pure metal. In the exam, they like you to compare renewable and finite resources, not only in the terms of which will run out and what we mean by these, but also comparing the amount of energy that they produce against the time it takes for them to form. Extracting a finite resource also has many risks. For example, we need to use lots of energy to extract or purify a finite product, and it is often bad for the environment as we are extracting or processing these. However, it is important to note that in the modern world we still use a huge amount of finite resources compared to renewable resources. On the whole, finite resources, especially fuels, tend to produce more energy when burnt. Along with reducing the amount of finite resources we use and increasing the amount of renewable resources we use, we can also carry out recycling. Mining and extracting metals takes lots of energy, most of which comes from burning fossil fuels. As such, we can recycle the materials, meaning that they can be used again. This reduces the amount of energy that's needed and means that we do not create as much landfill, as well as not damaging the environment during mining. We will look at aluminium recycling in more detail on the next page. However, all metals are usually recycled by melting them and then casting them into the shape of the new product. It is important to note that recycling still does use a lot of energy and can produce a large amount of carbon dioxide. So even though it is better than making the metal from scratch by extracting the ore, it still is not 100% green for the environment. We can also recycle glass. This massively reduces the amount of energy needed to make new glass products, as well as cutting the amount of waste. As with metals, we can melt these down and reshape them. However, some glass can be reused without reshaping. Usually, glass is separated by colour and chemical composition, as we looked at in the new materials video. The glass is crushed and then melted to be reshaped for use in bottles or jars. It's also important to note that when recycling, be it metals or glass, there is only a finite amount of times that you can recycle before you need to add more ore. One metal which we recycle heavily is copper. However, as well as carrying out recycling, we can also extract it in new ways from its ores. These two new ways are bioleaching and phytomining, which we looked at in the redox and extraction of metals video. As well as recycling, we can also ensure we are carrying out sustainable development. Sustainable development is an approach to development that takes account of the needs of the present-day society while ensuring that we're not damaging the lives of future generations. In order to do so, we try to use renewable resources. Extracting resources can be unsustainable due to the amount of energy used and waste produced, so we try to use renewable resources or reducing the number of processes that have been used. In order to ensure we are carrying sustainable development, we reduce the processes used. We reduce the number of finite resources and increase the use of renewable resources, and we try to reduce the damage to the environment. Unfortunately, some finite resources have to be used. As such, we try to use catalysts that reduce the amount of energy required for these processes, or find an alternative method of extracting the metal or the fuel, which causes less damage overall to the environment. Here we have a flow diagram showing the different stages of recycling of aluminium. We can see we have collection, then separating out into the different parts, gradually crushing and purifying before melting it. This melted aluminium, exactly as it would be from the electrolysis of aluminium, which we looked at previously, will be formed, flattened, and then turned into end products. For example, tinfoil, Coke cans, and aeroplanes. You do not need to know this exact process for aluminium. However, what it does show is there are lots of processes still involved in the recycling. Although recycling uses less energy than extracting the ores initially, it still uses some energy and as such can still be harmful to the environment. Finally, for this tutorial video, we're going to look at life cycle assessment. This is what a company does when they want to manufacture a new product. In this, they look at the life cycle of a product. So, to start off with, we have to think about how we're going to get the raw materials. This includes extracting them, the amount of water we're going to need, the damage to the local environment, etc. We then need to think about the manufacturing of the product. In this, we need to think again about the amount of energy we're using, the amount of pollution that we're making, and any waste products that are made during the manufacturing. We then need to think about using the product. During the use of a product, it might be that it's a product that's burnt to release greenhouse gases. It could be that it needs to be cleaned regularly using other chemicals. Finally, we need to think about product disposal. So what happens to it when we throw it away? In this step again, we need to think, is it going to end up in landfill? Can it be recycled? How much energy is going to be needed to carry this out? Are there any chemicals that we need to use in order to safely dispose of it? Throughout the life cycle assessment, from getting the materials, manufacturing, the usage, and then the disposal, we can also think about transporting the materials as well as any packaging that needs to be used. Transporting is something that comes into all of these aspects. Packaging, much more likely to be involved in the manufacturing of the product, but also getting the raw materials for that packaging. How can that packaging be disposed of? So what do we need to consider for each stage? Well, those initial materials, we need to think about what materials they are, how we're going to get them, do we need water, are there any chemical byproducts, are we releasing CO2? In the manufacturing, again, thinking about materials, water, any products that are made that we don't want, the energy required to manufacture, and again, byproducts, carbon dioxide, anything like that. In the usage, do we need chemicals to maintain it? Do we need water? Do we need energy for using the product? Are there any byproducts? And finally, disposal. How do we clean it? How do we transport it? As I said earlier, transport comes into all of these. And then, will it end up in landfill? Does it need to be incinerated? Or can we recycle it? This allows us to compare two different products. We can also take into account the time frame of the use. Is this a product that will be used once and thrown away, or is this a product that will be used multiple times, as that will affect the impact it has on the environment? There are, however, some problems with life cycle assessment. Often we can't give a numerical value to the effect of pollutants. For example, we can't see the effect of one plastic bag on the environment, for example. Secondly, producing a life cycle assessment is not an objective method, as it takes into account the values of the person carrying out the assessment, which means they can be biased. Finally, they can also be written deliberately biased in order to support the claims of a company to give them positive advertising. It is also important to note that life cycle assessments do not take into account the cost of producing a product, which a company would also obviously have to look at. We're now going to look at two questions within this topic. The first question is our big question. So we have iron, copper and aluminium can be obtained from substances in the Earth's crust. They can be made into many useful things. We're no longer required the metal articles can be thrown away or recycled. Our question really here is explain why it's important to recycle metals rather than put them in general household waste. You've got a sentence starter here and some key words. I want you to pause the video at this point and have a go at this question. So, what could we say for this? Well, copper is used for pipes, wiring and vehicles, aluminium for cans, wires and alloys or aeroplanes, and steel is used for bridges or stainless steel cutlery. Recycled metals can be made into something useful. This reduces the amount of finite resources, stops the metal ore running out, less damage to the environment from mining or quarrying, less waste in landfill sites so they're not going to fill up as quickly. Some metals do not corrode or break down, so they remain in landfill a long time. Fewer landfills are therefore needed, less damage to the environment from waste, especially copper waste, which is toxic, and it's a lot less expensive than carrying out electrolysis or reduction. The second question I want you to have a go at is this one, which is describe the life cycle assessment of an aluminium can. I want you to pause the video at this point and attempt this question. So, what could we have said for describing the life cycle assessment of an aluminium can? Well, bauxite is mined from the Earth's crust. Aluminium is extracted from bauxite by electrolysis, as we looked at in the extracting aluminium video. This is expensive as large amounts of energy are required to keep the ore molten. The aluminium is then manufactured and packaged. The product is used, so the can is used. Once it's been used, the product is disposed of. It can either then be recycled or it can end up in landfill. Lots of energy is required to recycle, but less than is needed for that initial extraction. So it's better to recycle than to have to extract from the ore again. That concludes this video on the Earth's resources. In the next video, we will look at potable water as well as how we can treat waste water.